Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's Thursday, the 9th of February, 2012, and our special guest is Alan Blankstein. Alan, thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So there are times when this interview series feels like it pays me dividends back in gold, and tonight is one of those nights. The serendipity here is hard to believe. This book is now on the top of my must-reads list, the very top, and I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to convince you of that in this recording, or if you're here live. There's so much of the material in this book that repeats things that we've talked about in the interview series that I'm actually feeling a little sheepish about some of the things that I'm going to bring up. So if it feels like we're hitting familiar territory, that's good. Repetition will be good for us. The Future of Education is sponsored by my Web 2.0 Labs project, providing places for educators to talk to each other, and Blackboard Collaborate, the user community I run for Blackboard Collaborate at wecollaborate.com. Coming up at the Q and ISTE shows, the terrific crowdsourced activities. This is the fifth year. It's the fifth year of Classroom 2.0, and it's the fifth year of our ISTE affiliation. EduBloggerCon, the all-day unconference on Saturday, has been renamed. It's now Social EdCon. The Bloggers Cafe will be there. We're going to do an Ed Incubator program. We've got live streaming. If you've never presented before, you can present. Not only can you present at the conference by signing up, but you'll also be able to be streamed out live. This is so much fun, and Q is letting us do the same kind of extensive program at the Q conference in Palm Springs. So if you're going to either of those conferences, please look up Q Unplugged or ISTE Unplugged. We will have a birthday cake at both, I think. So for the 5th anniversary of Classroom 2.0, we're doing a couple of fun things, one of which is the Ed Incubator program. PBS NewsHour is our first project, helping them find a group of educators to give them feedback on their programs. Just go to classroom20.com, click on Ed Incubator, and join up. It's a terrific group. They're dying to get some good feedback from teachers. We're also going to produce Classroom 2.0, the book. There will be a treasury of best practices of using web tools in the classroom, and you're going to write it. So every submission will get posted to the web. We're so excited about this. Some select number will actually be placed in a printed book, but do go to classroom20.com and click on the book to find out more. And we've got some great virtual conferences coming up. Of course, all of these are free, and they're worldwide. We're going to do a Classroom 2.0 celebration. We do have a date for the Gaming and Education Conference. That's going to be April 26th. The Alternate Education Conference will be May 10th through the 12th. That's homeschooling, unschooling, unplugged, everything. The Future of Libraries will be October 3rd to 5th, and the Global Education Conference November 12th to 16th. Coming up on the show, next week we talk to Khalid Smith, who's the lead at Startup Weekend EDU. A little bit of controversy there because they've now partnered with Pearson, but it will be very fun to talk to him, and we'll be gentle. Jane Hart's going to talk to us about social learning. Ruth Sueli is actually going to postpone, but Dennis Litke is a new addition to this list. He's coming on Friday, February 24th. He's been scheduled before and missed, but this time we're sure he's coming. David Weinberger is going to talk about his book, Too Big to Know. You've seen most of this list before. I'm actually going to go down to April 5th because Alan's going to know this, I think. Joseph Grenny, one of the co-authors of Crucial Conversations, was going to talk about vital behaviors and sources of influence. It should be a lot of fun. That will probably come up tonight as we talk. And I think everything we do, there are a couple of new ones there, but I think they've all been announced. If you've missed the show, they are all recorded. There are over 250 of them now. I'm kind of proud of that. I think we've really done a great job of bringing together a real diverse group of voices, many of whom are going to be mentioned tonight. So that's a lot of fun. They're all available at futureofeducation.com in full Blackboard Collaborate or in MP3 form. So this is our chance to let you indicate where you're participating from if you're in the live show. Look for the icons to the left of the map. You're looking for the star. It's the second one down. Double click on that and then click on the map. And you can let us know the time and the temperature. So it looks like Australia, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Is it Guam? Oh, that's Thomas, yes. Welcome, Thomas. Angela, nice to have you with us. Wherever you're participating from, or if you're listening to the recording, we sure do appreciate your taking the time to do so. You'll be well rewarded tonight. So Alan, Peter Block, Deming, Sengi, Bandura, Linda Darling-Hammond, Finland, Tony Wagner, the Dufours, Positive Deviance and Vital Behaviors. I've been doing this show for 5 years now, and I'm intrigued at how many connections you and I have on this topic, and yet we've never connected before. And I'm wondering if that tells us something about the educational technology world and a need that there might be to bridge with more traditional education reform ideas.
I'm sorry, was that a question?
Well, yeah, the question is does it tell us anything?
That there is a need for more technology to connect us?
I think the interesting piece for me was to realize that there have been discussions going on that I was completely unaware of, and that they're incredibly related to the kinds of things that we've been talking about, but there hasn't been a good bridging of the ed tech world with those conversations.
Well, you know, even the tech world itself isn't one world. It's splintered, and there are many, many technologies. The one that I'm using right now is new to me. That isn't to say that I'm a guru of tech. I'm not. In fact, I'd probably be better answering other types of questions than those focused only on tech. But I think that we're not in a monolithic, homogeneous situation. It seems to me that there's a wide variety of technologies out there, and except for a few that have risen to the top, like Facebook and Google, it's questionable as to whether there is one world or one technology that we can all look to connect us.
Well, this will be really fun, and I'm glad we're making this connection. I'm going to tell a short story. I promise to do less talking for the rest of the interview. But there were two things that have happened to me in the last month that really have led to my appreciation of the answers in the room. The first was I went to a conference at Stanford around the Finnish education system, and left the conference with having really sort of drilled down to a deeper understanding of what I think was taking place in Finland. I don't think it was the test scores. I don't think it was the practices. I don't think it was even the narrative of equity. I left somewhat convinced that it was the fact that there was a consensus narrative that allowed all of the stakeholders in Finland to come together and bring energy to that program. So then I went to a conference in Texas for the Horizon Report, where they do this process, this really brilliant process of sort of identifying technologies that they think are going to make a difference in education. And we got to the end of the 2 days, and I stood up and I said, they were asking for action items, and I said, I'm intrigued at the degree to which we want to push down the conclusions, but I'm convinced what we need to be doing is pushing down the process. So am I right in feeling as though I've directly connected with your material?
Yes, Steve, absolutely. In fact, I just had that same conversation with two different superintendents today. It is about the process, and we're somewhat infatuated with the product, at least here in the States.
Also discovered Roland Barthes, whom I didn't know before, and I had been reading his material and sort of stunned at this sort of what he describes as sort of list making, this idea that we will look at a set of practices, determine that the outcome is good, and so try and kind of push that list or the set of practices to others to follow through on. And you quote, and I think the book is titled after a quote by Peter Block, that talks about people will be accountable to those things or committed to those things that they have a hand in creating. Why is it we have trouble doing that?
That's a great question, Steve. I guess it depends on who we are. And in the case of the United States and in many other Western countries, you know, there's a heavy policy hand involved in education. And so policy is driven by, in this country, to a great extent, money. And unfortunately, moneyed interests really could care less as to whether or not there is a buy-in. And I would even like to go beyond the word buy-in, because that implies that I've sold you something. So it's really a matter of an intrinsic desire to address a particular item on the part of practitioners. And practitioners who have children right in front of them are inherently, along with parents, natural allies to wanting to inherently do what's good for those same kids. And so you mentioned Finland, but in this country, unlike in Finland, trust of practitioners is not very high, and that conspires along with moneyed interests to go and push an agenda that may not have anything to do with children.
You know, there's a line in the book that I sort of sat up and took notice physically, because you talked about the fact that there aren't financial incentives around this kind of local community-based process, and so these are not the solutions that are going to get pushed by vendors. Has anybody argued back with you, or is there pretty much an understanding that that's the case?
You know, I just had an exchange with Pedro Noguera, a friend of mine, online about his decision to resign from the SUNY Board of Trustees and his proclamation as to why he did it. And I asked him what his feedback has been like so far, because he was somewhat critical of the board he was on and the direction they'd taken. And he said he's mainly gotten good feedback, and he supposes those who disagree with him haven't contacted him. So perhaps that's the case for me as well.
Interesting. Okay. I really also was kind of intrigued by the connection with Tony Wagner, because Tony's been on the show and he talked about how he would do these community vision building experiences around education, and how the communities would often come up with almost identical goals and desires, but they then had skin in the game. They were a part of the process of building them. And we've talked at length on the show about sort of the 21st century skills model, and how the committees that create those lists probably have a great experience, but pushing that list down is not like pushing down the process. Can we take this a little bit further? Is there a parallel with, if we think about administrators and teachers going through this process of building a vision? I'm looking for two potential parallels. One would be with the students, and one would be with the parents. If we start with the students, should that same kind of process be taking place in classrooms?
I think it's a great idea. And you know, the issue again of trust comes up. So here's an interesting piece of information. When I started the group that's now called Solution Tree, I had published some of the main works at that point by the group that created Discipline with Dignity. And what we found out was that, you know, the advice that students be able to create their own rules for the classroom led to an exchange with the teacher, in which the students became far more severe in their declaration as to what the rules should be and what the punishments should be for breaking them. Like, you know, if he passes a piece of paper, we should break his arm. So it's a little bit over the top for some kids. But the point is that the kids were not easy on themselves as we thought that they might be. And the same is true, I would think, of their desire for their own success. Because if you look at the work of Ed Trust and Katie Haycock's work, you know, what they found in their research directly with children was that the students don't ask to be babied and ask to be let out of hard, rigorous academics. What they ask for is that the educators believe in them, show them how to do it, come prepared, and make the coursework relevant, but not let them off the hook. So the concerns about trust are kind of interesting. The second part is, will the students have the wherewithal, you know, intellectually to set their own curriculum? And to that end, I would say that would take an awful lot of work to get them to that point. But nonetheless, they would move in that direction. As to the specifics of what the curriculum would be, that's another question. I don't know whether or not they have that background to create their own curriculum, and I wouldn't advise it right off the top. But I would say that the more that the students are involved with defining what it is that is relevant and what they're going to need in life, the more likely they are to actually start to participate more rigorously in class.
It reminded me a lot of that idea reminded me a lot of the classroom meeting material that I remember reading, you know, many years ago. So is there a parallel also with parent involvement?
Yeah, there is. Again, similar to the students, if there's anybody who wants their children to succeed, it's going to be their parents. I know there's a bad rap on parents in some parts, but that's, I think, just a misplaced diagnosis of some problems that are being experienced. So because parents aren't showing up for all the PTA meetings doesn't mean that they don't care, for example. It can mean a lot of other things. So I hold that parents are probably the most staunch advocates of their own children and their own children's well-being and success in life. Now, that being said, if parents have the background and the understanding, for example, of what Tony Wagner talks about in terms of what's needed globally, then they're going to be the biggest advocates for, in fact, having a curriculum that is globally competitive.
So I'm going to go even one step further. I've loved your answer so far. We're looking at this at a very local level. Is there a parallel then even at a higher level with the larger education reform movement? And how would you translate these concepts into ideas around policy?
Well, in terms of content, you know, Common Core in America has already been created for 2 subject areas. In other parts of the world, there are equivalents. Finland has a common understanding of what every student needs to know coming out of the education K-12 equivalent, and the same thing goes in other countries. But in terms of the process and what can policy do to better advocate for the process, I've been thinking about that same question, and I think that instead of race to the top in our country and other such either competitive or policy-driven initiatives in which the focus is generally on the outcome, show us exactly how what you're going to do, and tell us that you're going to do everything we told you we want you to do, which is really what's going on in Race to the Top grants right now in America. Instead of that, the better approach would be to say, what's the process that you're going to use that's going to have these kind of criteria embedded in it? So one of the criteria is what you're getting to now, that the stakeholders would have skin in the game. They would actually want the outcome that they're working on, and that they would actually create what that outcome is to some extent. So I think maybe if policy, like everything else that we're involved in, including practice, were to shift from product to process, then we'd probably have something that really was scalable instead of something that only works in one particular spot.
So I've gone through the same thought process, and I'm living in Utah this year. I'm calling it a sabbatical, but it's been really interesting to be here because in Utah they have a real push for immersive language schools. And intriguingly, the narrative of immersive language schools seems to really bring everybody together. The students, the parents, the teachers, the administrators, and the legislators all seem to kind of agree. And I've wondered about those kinds of narratives that don't directly address teaching practices, but obviously have an impact when you teach a language that's high interactivity, highly participative. I've wondered if some of those programs that kind of come at it from the side don't end up being a good place to put energy, while the larger dialogue of moving to process is a little bit harder for people to swallow.
Yeah, I think that you put your finger on something interesting, Steve. I spoke to one of the top education officials who disperses millions and millions of dollars every year in grants. He's very bright, very extraordinary researcher, and I asked him about what are the grants going to be for, and then I asked him what he thinks works. And the answer was two different things. He said that he thought that, programs are going to get the money and that processes would actually be portable and that programs were not. So a program could work in one setting, in one context with, a certain amount of assistance from the outside provider, for example, and maybe not without the assistance later. So in other words, the program has a shelf life that's pretty short. Whereas he felt that processes were portable and that they could work in multiple environments, and principles, too, were portable. So, failure is not an option. The first book that I wrote, the subtitle is Six Principles That Guide Student Achievement in High-Performing Schools. And so these 6 principles would, from his vantage point, be portable to various contexts, but it's not what will get most of the funding. And so I asked him why, and incidentally, during this part of the interview, he asked that I shut the tape. That's a little telling, but he said that basically he didn't think that people could get their hands around it. They couldn't wrap their minds around it. It's just like what you've said now. It's a little bit too out there for many, and unfortunately, therefore, they go for the more canned, easily understood program.
Yeah, we've talked about on the show the role of narratives and how much they shape kind of what we do, and the need to have agreement, and the fact that the equity narrative in Finland is not one that would probably play very well here. We don't do equity well in the United States. We have a belief in bootstrap or opportunity, but we don't necessarily have a belief in equity. In fact, that could be a negative if you think of it as socialist or communist. But I've wondered also about the narrative of individual strengths. It feels like that's another kind of narrative that people gather around that then involves shifting practices and processes.
Individual strengths involving shifting practices and processes. You lost me a little bit there. I'm sorry, Steve. Help me out.
Well, that's okay. We've interviewed Jennifer Fox, who started a school and wrote a book on Your Child's Strength. It's sort of the Strength Finders movement. It's the look at individual and unique talents. It feels to me as though parents believe their children to be unique and valuable. It's a sort of a larger narrative that we've kind of uncovered in sort of mass customization, and this idea that you can buy sort of exactly what you need. And I've wondered if that narrative of individualization of learning is another case where it brings it's a narrative that people have consensus on, but also brings a change in the processes that take place in a school, or the opportunity to rethink process.
Well, the idea that we're all individuals and there needs to be differentiated, instruction and so forth, I think is on target, but not dichotomous with the idea that we do have some collective desires and potential collective vision. and there are a lot of commonalities between us that, we're 99% the same, biologically speaking. So both are true. They coexist, and I think both can be catered to. Obviously, without common mission, vision, values, and goals, for example, which is the first principle in the book I mentioned earlier, Failure is Not an Option, it's hard to run an organization. If everybody has different mission, vision, values, and goals, then you're all running in different directions. And similarly, within the classroom, there has to be some common basis for where the classroom is going. Now, as to how all the students learn and how who gets there first and so on and so forth, that's something that needs to be tended to on a different level. But the other part of that is that it doesn't have to be tended to as individual, isolated students. It can be tended to on an individual level just as well in community. In other words, one learning style and another learning style can be accommodated within a cooperative learning setting. And in fact, it's very much bolstered in most cases when you can create a cooperative learning situation. Let's say that you want to determine, the basis for Pythagorean theorem, and you start out with the students in the classroom and you ask them to start, working on that basis in smaller groups. Now, different students are going to have different levels of connection to that and aptitude to, respond to the question at hand, but they're all going to learn from one another within those groups. And ultimately, I think from our standpoint as a society and as a school and as a teacher, that's what we want. We want them to learn from one another. We want them all to succeed. I think the other part of what you're talking about is a more pernicious aspect of the challenge, and that is that there is in our society also a desire that a whole lot of people fail and that there be a winner. And that is problematic for education. When that starts to become an operating principle for a school or for a system or for a school system, then you've got a new challenge, and that's one that I think we need to address as we're talking through what is the meaning of school, what's the purpose of learning, and so forth.
Yeah, I actually had this conversation with Linda Darling-Hammond, whom I know you are well familiar with, but about how our narrative is competing interests. Our economic, political, and legal systems are based on this idea of competing interests, and it's very different than a narrative around equity. So I want to quickly get, there's more than we were going to have time to do here, but I wanted to get to Deming. Because Bloch's quote was basically the wisdom to solve the problem is in the room. And I've loved Deming for a couple of decades now, and again was delighted to see such a focus on him. My sort of simple take on Deming would be that his response was don't blame the worker. Look at the system, then teach the worker about the system and how the worker can help improve the system. Is that a fair description of what you learned from Deming?
It certainly is a big part of what I learned from him.
Tell me what I missed.
Well, so he had 14 points that he thought were, that were the Deming principles. And so, for example, point number 8 was drive out fear. So those things in some ways supported what you just said, but they also supported other parts of the system. So, another one was to basically have a common, vision and mission of what you're trying to do, a common aim. Another one, incidentally, was not to use numeric goals. And I think he named it arbitrary numeric goals. So those things support what you said, and they're interactive with it, and they also, in some cases, have a life of their own beyond it. But yes, that's a huge point, is that this is a system that everyone is working on, and if you're a leader within the system, your job is to understand a few things. One is variation, and the fact that there's some people who are going to do better than others. That's just what happens when you have any number of people, any number of items. There's natural variation, and that's called common cause. And then there's exceptional causes for the variation. Now, the common cause variation is within a given range, and your job as leader is basically to take that common cause of variation and live with it, try to narrow it wherever possible, but move the whole system towards the ultimate goal. So don't focus too much on changing common cause of variation. Just move the whole system towards excellence. The special cause of variation is the outliers at the very high end or the low end of that variation. And your job as leader then is to find out why they're outliers. For the bottom end, for the ones who are doing outside of the norm, what can you do to get them back into the system? For the top end, what can you do to make that extraordinary performance the norm for the rest of the system? How can you get everybody else up to that exceptional cause of variation? And you have to ask what it is that made that happen and find out the method that was used and see if that method could be normalized to the whole system.
So you're going to love the fact that I owned a small computer company and did this as we had an outsourced project that we worked on for Hewlett Packard. We had a team of employees inside one of their facilities running a process. And we were deeply into Deming at the time. We had an hour each week in which they would read a book together and talk about it, and then an hour for talking about process improvement. And then we had a measurement system which was entirely transparent, and we gave the group incentive to work together to figure out why those top performers were doing well and how to transfer that knowledge and all the like. Now, the intriguing end of that story was that Hewlett Packard came to us and said, you can no longer hold those meetings because it looks like your team is not working to the rest of the employees in the building. Do you see similar kinds of responses in the education world to this kind of Deming-like activity?
Steve, I think that what happens is that first of all, what Deming did, and I worked with him for a while. I mean, I was just a kid, but I was really excited and eager, and he took me under his wing, and he let me bring him into the educational arena. So we did that, and then we brought Peter Senge to join him, and then the rest was the launch of the PLC movement from there. So he found that even in corporations, he wasn't well understood. So the first challenge is to, actually be understood. The second one is, relative to that, is to be accepted. And if you're not understood, then usually all sorts of rumors start to abound about what you're saying and what you're doing and why you're doing it. And, there's a certain amount of paranoia in human nature. And then, if you are understood, then, there's another whole layer of things to do, like actually implement what is being, understood, do it in a way that's collaborative, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's very challenging to do something that's particularly innovative and new, which is what he brought to the table, and that all kinds of things do occur in any event to make it hard for such a new idea to enter an older culture. And that included not only schools. So I would say yes to your question about schools, but yes to your question about corporations too, where Deming had focused most of his life and where he felt he hadn't achieved much.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you called it out specifically in the book, but it did feel like there was a parallel of the made in America but used widely elsewhere. Deming, positive deviance, research on learning. Is that kind of a theme for you?
Yeah, sadly it is. Sadly it is. And, some of the people I interviewed from abroad agreed that we do some of the best R&D in this country of anywhere in the world, but that we're not even using our own R&D.
Yeah, that story actually came out quite a bit at Stanford in this conference with the Finnish people. They were very good. They were very quick to give credit to the research done in the United States for the practices that they were following. Okay, so tell us a little bit about what positive deviance is.
So briefly, and if you want more, I could tell you the story behind it that parallels our story, ours being the Hope Foundation and the work that we've done around this concept without even knowing that the concept existed. We just developed it out of the Deming work. But the idea is that in any situation, there's an outlier that's doing better than everybody else, even with the same resources. So, for example, if you go to a situation that's struck by malnutrition, as was the case in Vietnam, and that I described in the book, there are still going to be some people who are doing far better and perhaps aren't even malnourished. And so the idea of positive deviance is that there is a positive deviant that you can learn from and use to, it's kind of like what I was saying about the outlier with Deming. You can use to kind of leverage to bring the whole system up towards that same deviation.
Well, I went to a training a couple of months ago that I've talked about on the show at a company called Vital Smarts. We have a daughter doing a humanitarian program, and they were helping to train the humanitarian workers. And this is the bestsellers, Change Anything, and Crucial Conversations, and they talk a lot about positive deviance and vital behaviors. I left that training feeling a little bit uncomfortable because it felt as though the idea was to identify the positive deviance and then take an action that was not necessarily transparent or community-driven. What I loved about your description of the book was this requirement that I think I read, that the community and the people actually have to find the solutions themselves once you help them identify the positive deviance, or need to help also identify the positive deviance.
Yes, that's right. So because the case in Vietnam is so clear-cut and I can draw a circle around it, let me use that, and then I'll try to translate it into the work that we do. So in Vietnam, what happened was that Save the Children was brought in to address decades-old malnourishment among children and their families. And when they got there, since they were a U.S. nonprofit, the government basically said, we gave you a 6-month visa, but that's all we can give you. There is antipathy towards American organizations, so you'll have to prove efficacy in 6 months in this decades-long problem. So they drew from the positive deviance. Jerry Sternin and his team basically found in talking with the locals that there were some outliers that weren't starving. And within a short time frame, they found out what those outliers were doing. And so in order to do that, they had to get the people who were the locals and who were being trained as researchers in this project to stop looking at what they already knew and saying, well, we already do that. Well, we already know that. And start looking for what they didn't know and what they didn't expect, which is kind of like what we do in our field when we do this. It's like more like a treasure hunt than a witch hunt. And so when they found what they were doing, it didn't take long. It took a couple of months, so they still had 4 months left. So in other words, the easy part was finding the positive deviance. In this particular case, they had used small shrimp that they found in the rice paddies, and they fed it to their kids. They fed their kids 5 times a day as opposed to 2 times a day like all the others. They fed them even when they had diarrhea. They washed their hands regularly and so forth. So there were a few vital behaviors. But the team that found all of these vital behaviors was also part of the locals whose children were starving. So they had a lot of skin in the game. They all wanted to succeed. And so then the hard part for the next 4 months was, how do you get everybody else to do it? And the answer was to help them to have the same discoveries that you had, not to give them the answers, but to help them have the same discoveries. So when we do our work to scale positive deviance within a district, and we bring all the school-based teams together for a day of, quote-unquote training, instead it's really them talking and them learning from, one another, and them having new ways to converse, which we do give them. We give them tools to talk about things that lead to different outcomes. At the end of that day, they have to do a reentry plan, because if they come back with the answer, they're sunk. What they need to come back with is a process that they reiterate using the same tools that we used and the same tools that they've been using that whole day. So they have to reiterate that same process in their own schools in order to get to the conclusions that everyone else will then buy into.
And essentially what I hear you saying is, in every school, in every district, there are things that are being done well. And if we can focus on those in a positive way and use those as building blocks for within a process of identifying them, that people will want to come to understanding them and then building success around them. Sounds a lot to me like appreciative inquiry.
Boy, now you're bringing me back to my childhood, Steve. Yeah, so I think appreciative inquiry is part of it. The augmentation might be relative to some other fundamental principles that go into this process. As you said earlier, one is that you have to make sure that there is skin in the game, meaning, do I really want to do this? And in our current context, we have so much thrust upon us that we're told to do that a lot of times we just have to create the space for people to get beyond that and identify what they want to do. And it's surprising how there is overlap. And it's also surprising that when there isn't, sometimes, just like with the example I gave about children being tougher on themselves when it comes to developing disciplinary rules, sometimes and often what happens is that the practitioners actually want to do more and better than what minimum standards are requiring of them.
So I'm wondering if this is a meta question, or if it's just, if I'm asking a question that can't be answered. But is there a positive deviance, an identifiable positive deviant set of behaviors at an administrative or district level where you see this kind of a process iteration that can be identified at the highest levels where you would say, okay, this is a vital behavior we can really work on to help create larger change, sort of a larger domino effect?
Yeah, another great question, Steve. So let me give you an example of that in action. So we're in the Mansfield Public Schools. We've been there for a couple of years, and we've just kind of completed the work. That's in Texas. 40 schools. And in fact, right now we're in Fort Wayne, too, and we started with 6. As the beta test proceeded, they decided to go with all 53. In both cases, but I'll turn to Mansfield. What happens is that there's an infrastructure. Over the course of a couple of years, they developed this tight infrastructure for disseminating the information, plus a culture that wants to learn aggressively and actively. So in one of the schools, is the Worley Middle School in Mansfield. They had discipline issues that led to 2,000 incidents of in and out of school suspensions per year. In the first year of finding vital behaviors and spreading them, they had cut that to 1,000, and in the second year to 100. So here's how it worked. First of all, they were all part of our Courageous Leadership Academy, so they were all learning about these processes we're now discussing. Secondly, in that process, they also became very comfortable with learning walks, and they had defined their own desired outcomes of a learning walk. So the teachers and the leadership teams developed rubrics that they wanted to use in their own learning walks, and processes for giving feedback that were not problematic for the school culture and the trust. In fact, they augmented the school culture and the trust. So they had a means to give feedback after these learning walks. So when they decided themselves that they wanted to hone in on the issue of discipline, certain teams went to see those teachers who were succeeding with the same students everyone else was sending to the principal's office. They found what they were doing. A few vital behavior issues like instead of calling a kid out from across the room, they'd come up to them closely and say, "Johnny, I see you're playing with your paper clips and rubber bands, and it seems like maybe something's problematic. Do you understand the lesson? Is this a problem?" And often it was the problem, that they had a problem with the lesson. They didn't understand it. So the teacher would tend to that. And there were other behaviors too. But once they got these behaviors and they found out what led to excellence, they could quickly disseminate it because they had already put the wheels under the car, so to speak, and they had already had an infrastructure and a culture that supported spreading positive deviance. And that's how they went from 2,000 incidents to 100 incidents within 2 years.
I love that story in the book, and I actually thought of several places in my own life where I could use that example. Is it too simplistic to say that leaders who think about iterating process are more likely to have this kind of an environment in their larger institutions?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Because there are other elements that come into play. And incidentally, you know, this whole district has changed its construct. So that story that I share with you was quickly spread to the rest of the district. They have a means by which to communicate that's highly effective for them, and it goes beyond the information. The means of communication goes into the relationships, the culture, the connection that people feel to one another, the trust that they've developed. You know, trust is like a conduit, you know, of electricity. You know, if you have certain conduits to move electricity forward like wood, it doesn't go very far. But if you have another conduit, you know, like trust in this case, or you know, in another case, a metal conductor, it moves really well. And so trust is like, you know, one of these great conduits. So I think back to your question, you know, the leader understanding the process and having that kind of mindset may not be all that's needed to create these great conduits like trust within an organization.
Trust is certainly a word you hear a lot in the descriptions of Finland. Okay, so we're going to move to the Q&A portion of the show. The chat has gone by much too fast for me to keep track of it, but if you have a question for Alan, feel free to post it in the chat, and I'll feel free to post it again in the chat, or you can raise your hand. If you're a brave soul, I'm going to encourage you to do this. It's the third icon over in the participant window. If you raise your hand, I'll give you the microphone. But if you have a question for Alan, this is the time to start thinking about it, and feel free to post it. While we're waiting, would you tell us a little bit about the Hope Foundation?
So I started the Hope Foundation in 1989. I had already started what's now called Solution Tree in 87 and was running the two together. And it originally convened top-level national leaders from across disciplines, business, education, and government. And that's why we brought Deming into the educational circle, because his message was one of the most powerful that we were able to identify at the time, and across disciplines, although it wasn't well known in education. And so we did these policy level forums, and after I spun off the other company, which is a for-profit, I really wanted to just focus on how can we change the world and let go of the money-making aspect, which may or may not be wise. But in any event, I was a little schizophrenic. I wanted to focus on just the mission. And so the work started to get drilled down. Now we've talked about it, we've disseminated information about it, let's do it. And that's what we've spent the last more than a decade doing. And so we basically, while we do have books and DVDs and so forth, we also really get in there into the trenches and start to do two things. One is to scale excellence across an entire district or region, or in the case of South Africa, where my honorary chair, Archbishop Tutu, is, we did it in a province. And the second thing is turn around low-performing schools.
So Julie asks, what have you found to be the most effective way for teachers to engage parents in their students' learning? I know they care, but need their involvement in the child's lives.
Well, I think parents really want to be involved, and I guess it's just a matter of finding out what the obstacles to doing so are. And it's hard for me to determine from here. Again, I could talk about products and say, well, this school does that and that school does the other thing. You know, and there are a lot of them that are exciting, like they meet, you know, parents in McDonald's because they know that they tend to go there, or they meet them in church or whatever. But I think that the process part of my answer would be ask them.
Okay, so if you have a question for Alan, please feel free to type it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. That's the third icon over. As we watch a lot of the reform dialogue conversations taking place now in the United States, I feel like a lot of it's sort of like if Hewlett-Packard were to stand up and say, we're making crummy printers because our employees are crummy. How do we help shift that larger national dialogue? Are you seeing people who are effective at creating a much more positive story than the blame game?
Well, that's a big question, Steve. You know, I was just talking with the prior Secretary General Counsel for Secretary Education, Duncan, and the head of the NEA, and we were in a meeting that actually I had requested their presence to, and it was a small group of people, and I think that there was concurrence in the room, and I've heard this elsewhere, that there are some players like the Gates Foundation that are calling the shots to a great extent. And so if there's a counter narrative, which of course is what I guess I'm providing, and I think frankly so are so many educators who really know what's going on from the ground up, then we need some way to get our stories out there and our voices out there. And so you're doing a great service this evening, and you know, there are other means by which to engage the community that we're starting to do, for example, and others listening to this can do as well. We're doing a series of conferences that will include within it a town hall, and the town hall will bring the larger community in around a question that community wants to address. And so it's an on-the-ground, grassroots kind of way of communicating, but ultimately at the end of that, many of those leaders might come out with a new understanding, which can then translate into conversations with legislators, for example, or the media.
Could you imagine a way in which we could use this technology to do a kind of a worldwide event that allowed people to go through that process that you describe in the book of kind of the community building process? Could you do that on a large scale with having people meet locally and coming through this kind of a medium?
So is that an offer, Steve?
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about that then.
Well, I'm glad that sounds like then you could imagine it, because I can, and I think it would be really fun to think about. Have you ever used Future Search or open space technology or any of these other sort of non-educational forms of community building, and what's your take on them?
You just named two that I love and that I used in our conferences for a while. You know, boy, it's kind of refreshing to have this conversation because, as many of us know, the educational focus has narrowed to the lowest common denominators of basics and basic skills testing in our country, and in other countries too. You know, I can't bear all the blame here, but I think that it's been a narrowing of education. So yes, that's exactly what we did. In fact, the first conference that we put on under the Hope Foundation banner was called Rediscovering the Joy in Learning. And boy, who would ever want to attend anything that's joyous, right? But at the same time, if it's not, then what kind of child do you think is going to sit there for an entire day? So we were all about that, all about the open space, all about the future search. I concocted the most bizarre things for people to think we would actually do, and we did it, and it worked extraordinarily well.
I'm really glad to hear that. One of the parallels, and again, if you have a question for Alan, please put it in the chat. I'm just moving forward because I haven't seen another question. If I've missed it, I hope you'll draw my attention to it. I noticed some real parallels in your material to the kind of work that has taken place for me in building online communities. My Classroom 2.0 community, this Future of Education community, that there are principles sort of embedded in Web 2.0 of coming together to build something rather than building from the top down. And it's a story I end up telling quite a bit as people ask me why their social networking projects have not succeeded. Do you see something inherent in Web 2.0 technologies that provides sort of a ray of light in this kind of activity?
I'm not qualified to respond to that. I think it goes under the heading of could we use this technology to do a process together in different parts of the world. So I think for me anyway, in my experience, I need to know more in order to address that.
So for those of you who have listened to the show and know, I felt there was a real connection between the material in this book and the processes that we're using to build vibrant sort of teacher-led, teacher conversation communities that I feel are sort of dramatically providing an opportunity for changing narratives and working together. We'll look forward to connecting with Alan more on that. This is going to be the final question. Patrick asks, is there data to indicate positive feedback to parents has positive education benefits?
There's a lot of data that indicates that parental engagement of a certain type will have positive impact on student achievement. And while there are various types of parental engagement that one could aspire to, the one that seems to have the greatest benefit is when parents become partners in facilitating the work that needs to go on at home to support the work that's gone on in the school.
So, Alan, as a courtesy to our guests, we always end on time. So I'm clapping for you now. I'm hovering over the smiley face and clicking on the applause button. The answer is in the room is my new must-read recommendation. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about it. I'm so grateful for the chance to visit with you about it, and really delightful to get to know you a little. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks to Alan. Thanks to you who have attended. Next week, Khalid Smith talks about Startup Weekend EDU, and Jane Hart will be talking to us about social learning. Hopefully we'll bring a little bit more of Albert Bandura into that conversation. This has really been a treat, and again, this for me is a must-read. I really loved it, and it brought together all the threads of the things that we've been talking about in the recent past. We appreciate your being here, and take care, everybody. Have a good day or a good night. Bye now.